story begins in medieval times. The McGuires were the rulers and kings of Fermanagh. Europe was being ravaged by the 100 Years' War between England and France. The McGuire kings lived unperturbed in this remote corner of Gaelic Ulster. Even the changes which the Norman conquest brought to most of Ireland had passed Fermanagh by. In the early part of the 15th century, during the reign of King Thomas McGuire, Enniskillen Castle was built by his brother Hugh McGuire to guard one of the few passes into Gaelic Ulster. King Thomas McGuire ruled from the family seat at Lisnaskea, as his forefathers had done for well over 100 years. Kings were crowned with ceremony. It was a time of relative peace, although unruly subordinates were kept in their place when necessary. Poetry from those days speaks of the generosity of the king and the beauty of Fermanagh. The paradise of Ireland is Fermanagh, the peaceful, fruitful plain. The murmuring of her waters is heavenly music, golden flowers on her land. But not all the poets of the time held their king in high esteem. Epithets like stingy, grudging, stinking-gummed and half-blind were used by one poet to describe King Thomas McGuire, who was not, apparently, generous enough for the poet's liking. He was, however, a good ruler, astute enough to get his brother Hugh to build castles at Monet and Enniskillen to control his territories. After his death in 1430, his son, Thomas Oge, inherited a well-established kingdom. Life was generally quiet and enjoyable, but when trouble came, usually from another aspiring clan, it was brutal and savage. At one time he slaughtered the O'Rourkes and had 16 of their heads impaled outside his palace. King Thomas Oge gave Enniskillen Castle to his brother Philip to patch up a family quarrel. Peace lasted throughout his reign. The arts flourished, and the church enjoyed a new era of prosperity. This window, now in the parish church of Monet, was part of a major rebuilding of the Augustinian Abbey on Devonish Island. This was the work of a master mason named Matthew O'Dugan. The family church of Achallurcher was one of many restored about the time. It was given a fine French roof, as it was then described. It was an age of pilgrimages. The McGuires, with many Irish clergy and nobility, flocked to the shrines of Europe. Pilgrims from all over the countries of Europe passed through Fermanagh on their way to St. Patrick's Purgatory at Lough Derg. They were welcomed as guests at the many lakeside and island churches of Lough Erne. It was a time, too, for craftsmanship and scholarship. This fine chalice was one of many gifts presented by the McGuires to the church. The monastic libraries abounded with handwritten books of poetry, grammar, and law. The Annals of Ulster was an important work of this time, telling us a great deal about the early history of the McGuires. It was begun in the late 15th century by Cachal MacManus McGuire, Archdeacon of Clocher, at his island home of Shanid in Upper Lough Erne, now called Belle Isle. The McGuires had a reputation for being generous and hospitable to poets and musicians. In return, the poets sang the praises of the king. On the lovely hills of McGuire's homeland, the eye loves to rest. A long lake as a chapelet borders the land, and blue streams flow through it. court life in Enniskillen Castle was both comfortable and convivial, much like medieval court life in London or Dublin. The ladies did fine needlework and looked after the herb garden. The menfolk went hunting with their dogs. In the evenings, there was feasting, music, and poetry. It was a fine life for the privileged, living in their castles and monasteries. But at the close of the 16th century, it came to an abrupt end. Queen Elizabeth I lived with one great worry. She was constantly afraid that King Philip of Spain would use Ireland as a base to launch an attack against England. To prevent this, she ruthlessly determined to conquer the whole country, including its remote north. Besides, the Gaelic-speaking Irish were barbarians who would clearly benefit from English laws, customs, and order. They are a race uncouth of customs, rejoicing in war, pillage, and music. They have no tables, but set their meat upon a bundle of grass, and use the same grass for napkins to wipe their hands. Predictably, the Ulster lords deeply resented this interference. In 1593, King Hugh McGuire of Fermanagh fought the English near the present town of Ballyshannon. He could not stomach any longer the humiliations inflicted by the English. The last straw came with the arrival of an English sheriff in Fermanagh, in spite of heavy bribes to stay away. He attacked the might of the well-equipped English forces. He was the first of the Ulster lords to rebel in an ugly, bloody war that was to last for 9 long years. As the dust on the battlefield finally settled at Ballyshannon, both sides claimed a victory. In the months that followed, the leaders realized that whoever held Enniskillen Castle held the key to ultimate control. In January 1594, the English made hasty preparations to attack the castle. It was a good time to act. The king, Hugh McGuire, was away, leaving behind only 35 soldiers for the castle's defense. The defenders watched anxiously. Cannon were dragged through the surrounding swamps and bushes. Musketeers dug in. 3 falcons were set up at close range. It was too late to get the women and children to safety. It was too late to save McGuire's great herd of cattle from being taken. On the 26th of January 1594, the castle came under siege and was continuously blasted by cannon. 4 days later, an already dire situation became hopeless for the McGuires. Fresh English troops appeared on the horizon. They were sent by the powerful governor of Connaught, Sir Richard Bingham, under the command of his brother, Captain George Bingham. 2 days later, they launched a final assault across the water. The soldiers quickly breached the castle walls and poured inside. The McGuire forces surrendered to Captain Dowdall. The English held Enniskillen Castle for 15 months, and all that time, the McGuires were close by, plotting to retake it. Their moment came in the spring of 1595. English troops were sent to bring food supplies to the castle. Hugh McGuire made a surprise attack on them before dawn as they camped beside the Arnie River. He routed them. The scene of this attack became known as the Ford of the Biscuit, because of all these provisions left on the battlefield by the English. The Enniskillen garrison, with no fresh supplies, were faced with starvation and had to surrender. Hugh McGuire was once more king of his castle. But his joy was to be short-lived. The war against England had now spread through the whole country, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. In the depths of a harsh winter in 1600, Hugh McGuire felt obliged to go to Munster with O'Neill to gather support. Then a tragic blow struck. Hugh McGuire was killed near Cork in the month of March. Hugh was succeeded by Cohonnet McGuire, and he was with O'Neill when the last great battle took place. It was at Kinsale in County Cork on Christmas Eve, 1601. Spanish soldiers had come to support the Irish, but their help was to be of no avail. The English, under Lord Mountjoy, defeated Hugh O'Neill, the McGuires, and the combined Irish and Spanish forces. Humiliated by defeat, apprehensive for their future, the leading Irish chieftains decided to leave Ireland. Cohonnet McGuire went secretly to the continent to get a ship. In September 1607, he brought it to Lough Swilly in Donegal, and there he was joined by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and Rory O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell. They set sail for France with their families, never to return. Their lands were confiscated by the Crown, and their leaderless people were left to mourn what history has named the flight of the Earls. The way was now clear for the subjection of the Irish, and for King James I to put into effect his plan of establishing loyal British subjects on Ulster soil. Known as the Plantation of Ulster, it enticed landowners and minor gentry from England and Scotland to settle in Ulster. In return for grants of land, they agreed to bring plenty of British workers with them to build strong houses and to create towns. And so, around the shores of Lough Erne, in the early 17th century, new landowners in an unfriendly land built well-fortified castles and cottages for their tenants. Many towns today owe their origin to these small plantation settlements. Enniskillen, Lisnaskea, Newton Butler, McGuires Bridge, Ballinamallant. Occasionally, the efforts of these settlers died with time. At Callow Hill, a solitary pillar of stone stands where once a town had prospered. In this part of Ulster, Enniskillen was the most successful plantation town. Captain William Cole, the new constable of Enniskillen Castle, was its chief architect. First, Cole rebuilt the ruined castle and erected a house for his family just outside its walls. He then added to the outer defences of the castle the turreted building known today as the Watergate. The town began with all the obligated buildings. There was a small church where the cathedral now stands. An earlier courthouse on this site contained a jail. There was a simple market house where the present town hall is. Within 20 years, the population of Enniskillen had grown to around 180, just about half the size of New York in those days. It soon became a thriving market and island town, approached from the west by a fine wooden bridge, later replaced by stone. Merchants had to pay a toll here when bringing their produce to the Thursday market on the Diamond. Today, the Thursday market still takes place, little changed from the days of William Cole. In those days, too, one could adjourn to a local inn for refreshments. There was even one owned by William Cole himself, where he and his wife Susan provided wine and home-produced spirits. Then suddenly, one October night in 1641, this peaceful life was shattered. Fires were lit on the Ulster hilltops as a signal for the disinherited Irish to rise in rebellion. They were led by Sir Phelim O'Neill, Conor McGuire, Baron of Enniskillen, and others. Spurred on with hopes of getting their land back, they fought for full civil and religious rights. That night, William Cole, dining at Crevenish Castle, was fortunate to get safely back to Enniskillen and to warn Dublin of the rising. The planter tenants rushed to their landlord's castle for refuge, where, for a time, they held out. Many were slaughtered without mercy, and many castles fell or were sacked. The rebellion fanned out into a war lasting 10 years, until Oliver Cromwell finally conquered the country and subdued the Catholic population. Peace slowly returned to the shores of Lough Erne. Economic prosperity, enjoyed by Catholics as well as Protestants, brought about surprisingly good relations between the two. But the Civil War, which broke out in 1689, dashed prospects of a full reconciliation. The Catholic king, recently deposed from the English throne, arrived in Ireland backed by the King of France and 5,000 French troops. He came to raise Irish Catholic support against the new Protestant ruler of England, William of Orange. Again, war was on the horizon and battle lines were drawn. Most of the country supported King James, but the Enniskilleners, like all Ulster settlers, came solidly behind the cause of King William. Fearing an attack on the town, they built a drawbridge at the east end, and overlooking it, a large earthen fort, still to be seen at Fort Hill. But the actual battle took place some 20 miles from the town, near Crum Castle. The timely arrival of the Enniskillen soldiers helped the local garrison to defeat the Jacobite army. Battle successes continued for the Enniskillen troops. They culminated in the Battle of the Boyne, when King William and King James, each claiming the throne of 3 kingdoms, finally faced one another across the River Boyne. The Williamite commander Schomberg was killed, but his army was victorious. King James fled to France, and by the following year the Williamite victory was achieved. The Enniskillen soldiers later became the Royal Inniskilling Dragoons and the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. These regiments distinguished themselves in numerous foreign campaigns. As the turmoil and bloodshed of the 17th century receded, some sense of security returned to Fermanagh. The 18th century brought unprecedented prosperity and the golden age of the Protestant ascendancy. Farming flourished, harvests and trade were good. The first Earl of Belmore became wealthy enough to build a country mansion at Castle Cool, incorporating the finest craftsmanship of the day. Tenant farmers and peasantry had to settle for less. In Enniskillen, the Royal School was moved from the town centre to a large site on Portora Hill, and the Cole family moved from the castle, with all its medieval inconvenience, to a new mansion house, Florence Court, at the foot of Ben Ochlan. Coles, McGuires, Flanagans, Crichtons, Lunneys and Breslins. Time changes their fortunes. Some will be remembered in the early annals or in verses of poetry written long ago. Others will be remembered in the music composed for them by the blind harper Carolan, and in the buildings which have outlasted their days of greatness. Enniskillen Castle is not only a monument to McGuires and Coles, it is a reminder of a stormy past, a past which has shaped our present.